Hello everyone, SMA Watts here, and we're about to do a deck tech on Modern Fish, which is a tempo or aggro control deck that tries to put a fast clock on your opponent with lots of synergistic, low casting cost creatures, and uses a light disruption package to sort of keep them off their game long enough to close the game out. Worth noting that Modern Fish is only about 4 cards different than Legacy Fish for the most part. They don't. It doesn't get Force of Will. It doesn't get True Name Nemesis, Days, or Umezawa's Jite. But other than that, it's very similar. So if you're looking to build both a Legacy and a Modern deck, this is a good place to kind of get a 2-for-1. Now, the first card that you need to talk about when you're talking about fish is actually not a fish. It's Aether Vial. Well, databases do hate it, and when you're typing out a deck list or sending a deck list to someone, that it's alt 146 for that AE thing. Um, it's not exactly the nicest card to type out, but it's really powerful. It's one of the more powerful cards in Modern that doesn't see a lot of play. To think about Aether Vial and how it actually works properly, it's sort of like a Soul Ring that produces colored mana that can only be used to cast creatures, but gives those creatures flash, makes them uncounterable, and your opponent doesn't even get to know what it is till it's already in play, which, especially for fish, can be very powerful. Like, if you're gonna, like, they don't know if you're playing a Lord, they don't know if you're playing Silvergill to draw a card, or you might be playing a Kira to prevent them from being able to cast removal later in the turn. It does a lot of things, and it gives you a lot of hidden information advantage. Okay, the backbone of the fish deck is going to be the Lord and Master here. Lord of Atlantis, Master of the Pearl Trident. You can't ask for much better than 2-mana 2/2 Lords, especially since they're also on creature type. So if you have both of them in play, they're both 3/3 Island Walkers. Fish represents a small enough amount of the metagame that Lord of Atlantis isn't going to generally be too much of an issue. Yes, if your opponent's playing Mutavault, their Mutavaults will get +1/+1 and be unblockable to you. Other than that, they're functionally the same card, and you're going to run 4 of both because they're that good. I suppose if you really, really, really felt like you didn't need 4 of both, you'd be wrong, but you could cut 1 Lord of Atlantis. But you shouldn't. Next up, we have the rest of the fishy cast. Curse Catcher is your 1-drop. He's a 1-mana 1/1. You often end up playing him turn 2 because you have an Aether Vial. He seems relatively innocent. I mean, as innocent as a creature from the Black Lagoon with hands full of golden fire can. But what he actually ends up doing is he's an immense tempo play. If your opponent's actually thinking about casting instants and sorceries, he has to realize that if you don't want him to resolve that, he can't tap out for them. So he kind of acts on your opponent, generally on turn 2 through 4, sort of like a Thalia, keeping your opponent basically from playing out as much as they want without fear of you countering it. Though against some decks, he's just a 1-mana 1/1. Then we have Silvergill Adept. You have to have 4 Silvergill Adepts. The fact that it replaces itself comes in virtually, like, its drawback of costing an extra 3 if you don't have a Merfolk in your hand is also counteracted by Aether Vial, and the fact that we run a ridiculous amount of Merfolk. So, I mean, almost always it's a 2-mana 2/1 draw card, which is fantastic. Sometimes it's a 2-mana 4/3 draw card. Mirror Regery, if you want more Lords, and you generally, I like to run about 12 Lords, Mirror Regery is your 3rd best Lord. It's also worth noting there's some tricks you can do with Mirror Regery. If you're actually casting Merfolk, for instance, Curse Catcher and Silvergill Adept, you can untap your land to keep yourself open for counter magic on the turn after you play the Regery. You can tap down key blockers. He does a lot of work, even though he doesn't make your creatures unblockable. He helps you get in for a good amount of damage sometimes. And then the most recent edition, and one of the things I think pushed this deck back into being tier 1, is Master of Waves. One of the problems you'd run into before is that against some decks, you'd build up and then they'd play Pyroclasm or Fire Spout. That's the one I was thinking of. And they'd clear your board, and you'd be, they'd have 3-for-1 to you, and you'd be down, and you'd maybe have like a creature to play, and just you wouldn't be able to remount the pressure. With a single Spreading Season play, Master of Waves puts 6 power on the board that turn. He is a must-answer threat, and while he looks kind of fragile as a 2/1, the only the only well-ran removal spell that gets rid of him is Path to Exile and Dismember. He can't be bolted because he's pro-red, and he can't be Abrupt Decay because he costs 4. So he dodges a lot of the go-to removal in Modern, which I think is one of the things that when I first saw him, I didn't like him but in Modern, the fact he can't be Abrupt Decayed is huge. Honorary Fish. These guys, they don't look like Merfolk. So the Phantasmal Image apparently does a really good job of looking like a Merfolk, especially online when they actually show you the picture for the card you copied. Phantasmal Image can act as additional copies of Lords of Atlantis and Master of the Pearl Trident. There is somewhat... He does open you up to having some awkward... if you play him turn 2... or turn 3, I guess, to copy a Lord of Atlantis, and it's the only thing in play. You can run into the problem of if they kill your Lord of Atlantis, your Phantasmal Image comes into play with nothing to copy and dies. So you got to be aware of not opening yourself up to that. And I don't think you necessarily want 4 of them because they a double Phantasmal Image draw can be miserable. It's bad off the top, but its upside far outweighs its downside. And it can be brutal with Master of Waves. If your opponent has a removal spell for Master of Waves and you Aether Vial in a Phantasmal Image in response, you don't lose the tokens, you get more tokens, and you continue the beatdown train. Kira Great Glass Spinner, which now that I look at it, I realize is a really odd name and picture. But Kira's awesome. One of the other problems you can run into is if your opponent's playing a heavy spot removal deck, they can slice and dice your team so that leaving you with just some 1/1s and some 2/1s that aren't particularly threatening by targeting your lords. Kira, though, basically turns off all of the single target removal in your opponent's deck. They have to 2-for-1 themselves to get rid of Kira before they can even really start using any other removal. And if you have a second Kira in your hand and an Aether Vial, when they go removal spell for gets countered, removal spell for Kira, you can Aether Vial in another Kira, sacrifice the one that's going to be killed by the spell, and it keeps them from being able to target any member of your team in response. Also worth noting with Aether Vial, Kira's ability is triggered upon the declaration of the spell, not the resolution. So she has to be in play before they use the spell, so you can't Aether Vial her in response to counter it. If you try to save a Lord by Aether Vialing your Kira in, you're just going to have a dead Lord. So generally, you're better off playing her on your turn earlier rather than later, unless you're afraid of a Wrath or a Pyroclasm. Okay, Merfolk is actually a pretty big tribe with a pretty deep bench. And there's a lot of creatures that have the creature type Merfolk that are not necessarily kept out by their actual power level, but by their relative power level or utility. Kosi Trickster. I've seen a lot of decks replacing Curse Catcher with Kosi Trickster, because if your opponent's playing something like Pod or any multicolored Modern deck where they run a ton of fetches, Kosi Trickster can easily be a 1-mana 3/3. It can easily be a Wild Nacatl for you that then becomes a 4/4 with Island Walk. I think that the power level of the Trickster is there, but I think the Curse Catcher is slightly better. Because of its you don't generally see what the Curse Catcher is doing for you, But the Coasty Trickster certainly seems powerful enough to warrant some testing. If you enjoy it, I'm not going to say it's necessarily wrong, but I think that either one's probably good, but I'm not 100% sure which one's correct. And I think it's going to be based heavily on your metagame. If you're playing against a lot of pod decks and a lot of like hate bears, a lot of decks that play creatures and shuffle effects without a lot of spells Curse Catcher can counter, Coasty Trickster is going to be vastly better. If you're playing against a lot of Storm, a lot of Twin, a lot of Tron, just to a lesser degree, you're probably going to get more mileage out of the Curse Catcher. No, Blue Red Delver was the deck I was trying to think of that I had. All right, Dacra Mystic. I've also seen Dacra Mystic getting played, and I think it's terrible. Like, it just seems bad. I mean, it's a 1-mana 1/1. It costs mana and has to tap to activate an ability that is really hard to not be symmetrical. Like, yes, if you know your opponent's flooded, you can draw, and they get, it's a land for them and a spell for you. You both draw it, and you're kind of up a card. If you know your opponent's mana screwed, and you flip it over, and they were going to get a land, you can bin it. It seems like there's going to be some games where you get a lot of mileage out of it, but it seems like that's going to be like maybe 1% of the time. And most of the time, you're going to be like, this is a 1-mana 1/1. And occasionally, I waste mana and tap it to do nothing. Tidebinder Mage. There's no problem with Tidebinder Mage, except that you generally only want to play a 60-card deck. If you're playing against a lot of Goyfs and Oozes, if your metagame is just packed full of green decks, you can pre-side, you put them in the main deck, and you're basically just pre-sideboarding. And then you can swap them out for something else in games 2 and 3. But basically, if you think you're going to play against, for instance, 5 rounds, 3 decks that are going to play Tarmogoyf and Scavenging Ooze, then Tidebinder Mage should be in your main deck. I don't think 60% of the decks in Modern generally do, so it's going to be based on your metagame. It also taps red creatures. There's only a couple that come to mind. Most of them aren't really that consequential, but worth noting. Coral Helm Commander is always been on the fringe of this deck. He was usually snuck in as a 1 or 2 of. He's not particularly great early, but he acted as a good late game mana sink. Since if you had, if you viled him in, paid 4, you had basically an air elemental that was also a lord. But he usually ended up getting bolted in response to that 4th activation. So I was always a little bit on him, and I think he's gotten kind of pushed out by the Master of Waves now. Bad Sig. Sig River Cutthroat. This seems like a win more card to me. It seems like if you're a little bit ahead, he can help you get really far ahead. And he seems like at any other board state, he's either going to just push, you're going to be just drawing extra cards the turn you kill your opponent, or he's going to be a 1/3 for 2 that does very little for you. Like, I don't think he's where you want to be for a card. He just feels like a win more. Wake Thrasher, I could see the potential. This guy could easily hit for 7 or 8, maybe even 10 or 11 with some lords. But he's so fragile as a 3-mana 1/1 on your opponent's turn, and you've got to go so all in on him. I don't know. Like, he seems very high risk, high reward, but I'm not sure I like him by himself. And Merfolk Sovereign, just sort of pass. I mean, I could see a version of Fish where you were like, I'm going to run 4 lords, 4 masters, 4 Regeries, 4 sovereigns, 4 Coral Helm Commanders, and all of my creatures are lords. And maybe Merfolk Sovereign's okay in that version, but that version's a very linear deck that's a little bit, might actually end up being a little bit slower. And I think I'd rather run Phantasmal Images than Merfolk Sovereigns. All right. Our main disruption package is actually going to be Spreading Seas and Vapor Snag. Like this is our interacting with the board. Spreading Seas punishes the very greedy mana bases of Modern. Um, Often the greedy mana bases are looking for black and green, not blue. And you can, in addition to making it so that they can't cast their double black into triple green spells, what you're actually, you also enable your lords to just cause all your fish to be unblockable, and you get to draw a card. It's a very powerful tempo play. It's sort of like 2 mana, Stone Rain, cantrip, and your creatures are unblockable. It's not quite that, but it can be. Vapor Snag is often going to feel like Time Walk in turn 2 or 3, and your opponent also happened to lose a life. In the late game, it might not be as good. It works pretty well against Twin still because it's a 1 mana answer to them putting Twin on a creature. Less good against Kiki Jiki because they can just do it again next turn. But it does, you can really get a tempo blowout with Vapor Snag, often causing your opponent to lose 4 mana for the 1 you spent. Our counter magic suite, often, it consists of a combination of Spell Pierces and Remands. I'm not currently running Remand myself, though that's a little bit more of a cost issue. Remand is a huge tempo play. Spell Pierce is really good against almost everything but Pod. I mean, in Pod, it still counters Birthing Pod on turn 2, which can be backbreaking. It still counters Court of Calling, which can enable them to assemble their combo. But Pod basically plays 30 creature spells, so your Spell Pierces are a little dead against them. Remand is never dead, and never underestimate the advantage of if your opponent's playing a control-ish deck and they go to counter one of your spells and you have a Remand in your hand, you can always Remand your own spell, draw a card, and their counter spell still gets bent. Other than that, Remand is a relatively expensive uncommon, so. Now, there are other options, though. Probably the most played after the big 2 there is Mana Leak. Powerful. It's easy to cast as a 1 and a blue. It's only going to be dead if your opponent has like 6 manas when it starts to become kind of a shady card. I generally find even then you'll probably still be able to occasionally snipe a spell. Unified Will is situational. It's really good against like the creature light decks, which are few and far between, but against Storm and Tron, which are not very good matchups, it's a very powerful card. Against Pod and like Hate Bears, and to a lesser extent Twin. Like Twin, it's sort of on the fence. But if they're playing anything that's blue-red and playing Young Pyromancer, it's bad. Blue-red, more top-end, it's good. Rune Snag is a card that's hard to evaluate. The first one is worse than Mana Lake, but often works out to be about the same. If you aren't running Snapcaster, at that point it is better than Mana Lake. If you are running Snapcaster, you can't run Rune Snag. You also can't run Rune Snag if you're not going to run 4 copies of Rune Snag. So that's kind of what keeps it, I think, out of a lot of decks, is you don't necessarily want 4, Mana Leak's main deck, and you don't necessarily want to never side out your Mana Leaks. Deprive, blue, counter target spell. I'm sold. Return a land, it's a really weird cost. Because what it's really costing you is your land drop next turn. And I don't think that's bad. I think it's better than it costing 3. It's a hard counter. I'm currently running it as a 1-of just to see how good it is, but I'm sort of on the fence on it still. Disrupting Shoal is not Force of Will. I do not like this card. I understand the idea that it enables you to interact when you're tapped out. I think the problem is that most fish decks are very, very densely on 2 mana. Like almost all of the cards tend to be bunched up at the 2 mana spot. which means it only really counters 2 mana spells, and those aren't the spells you're worried about your opponent slipping through while you're tapped out. It doesn't counter Birthing Pod, doesn't counter Splinter Twin, doesn't counter any of the creatures that are part of those combos, except for like Melira. It it and there's very few other things that you're going to be willing to 2-for-1 yourself to counter. And then it's just a really expensive counterspell if you're trying to actually cast it. If you're going to cast an expensive counterspell, you'd probably rather cast Cryptic Command. I love Cryptic Command. I just don't think it has a home right now in Fish. I think if Modern slowed down a turn or two to where Fish could reasonably expect that on turn 4 they're attacking with guys and can hold up a Cryptic Command, that'd be great. But I don't think Modern's ever going to become a format where you can reliably have 1 blue, blue, blue in an aggressive deck on turn 4. I think you need to be playing 3 and 4 drops still. Thassa, Goddess of the Sea. Well, technically God. Gods are gender neutral, apparently. She's powerful. She's not as unremovable as she is in Standard. Her passive effect of letting you scry 1 during your upkeep is nice to keep the gas up. I'm not sure how much you need to scry 1 to warrant the card you've used. I guess about 2 to 3 is about the point where you've really drawn a card. Making your creatures unblockable seems not that great in a deck that can already have its entire team be unblockable. So really, it's a matter of how often you're going to have Devotion of 5, and do you really need the 5/5 non-Merfolk when you have Devotion 5? I don't think you do. I mean, if you have 2 Lords turns it on, a Spreading Seas a Lord, and a Silver Gill turn it on. Most of these situations seem like you're doing fine already. The 5/5 is nice, but still dies to Dismember, still dies to Path. I don't quite think her slot in Modern is warranted. And I don't think if you wanted to play her, you could justify playing more than 1, because the last thing you want is 2 of them in your opening hand. Or even to draw a second one at any point during the game. Though, conveniently, she does prevent you from drawing another. Lands. Islands are good. I like the Bader one. The full art Zendikar ones are pretty nice. The unset ones are pretty cool too. But in a pinch, any island will do. You're going to want about between 14 and 16, depending on your other sources. You're also going to want 4 Mutavaults. It acts as a Merfolk. It also technically is an elemental if you have Master of Waves out. It'll occasionally get that extra +1/+1. And sometimes your opponent won't realize that your Mutavault is 1 bigger than they're thinking it is, because they're mentally thinking it's just a Merfolk like all the rest of your creatures. And it's not. Like Master of Waves does pump it. Choke is a card. Some decks do run it in their sideboard. Usually it's a 1/2 of. It is sort of a free roll to play one of these 2 or both as a replacement for a single island, since they come into play untapped, they produce blue. You're not really making yourself vulnerable to Blood Moon. I mean, if your opponent's casting a Blood Moon against you, even unless you drew both of them and a Mutavault, it's going to have very little impact. So they're worth running at least 1 of, maybe 2. Minimo can untap Kira or Thassa if you're running it, which seems really meh. Oboro can theoretically cost you your land drop to filter a colorless into a blue, which also is kind of eh. But generally, the advantage here is that they aren't actually islands, so that they don't get choked out. Running them is very low cost, very low effect, really. Some decks are going to want the Mana Disruptions package in addition to Spreading Seas. You can run Ghost Quarter or Tectonic Edge. I generally tend to favor the Tech Edge, but I don't think you quite want them in the main deck. I think there are matchups where if you want them, you're probably going to want to switch out your Aether Vials for Tech Edges. and use them to kind of keep your opponent off of like 4 lands. Those feel like really, really niche scenarios. I'm not sure, like beyond Tron and like Scape Shift, I can't really think of when you're going to want to do that. But those are the matchups that it comes to mind as you probably want to, and you want Tech Edge in both cases. Like Ghost Quarter keeps them off of the turn 3 Tron, but they often are assembling Tron on turn 4. Nothing can stop the God Draw Trons, really. Alright. Modern has very good mana. You can reliably splash a second color if you really want to. I don't think it's free. It is a trade-off. What you're generally getting, if white is the most common, and that's due to Wonderwine Hub being basically an extra dual land that has almost no cost turn 1 or 2 for the deck. You get to swap out your Void Snag in almost all cases for a real removal spell. In white, you get some very powerful sideboard bullets against certain matchups. In black, you get hand disruption. And in red, you're going to get a little bit more reach and slightly more versatile cards like Is It Charm over, for instance, Mana Leak, which will counter a lot of spells, can kill a lot of creatures, and sometimes can just get you out of a bad draw. But the trade-off is your one, making yourself more vulnerable to Blood Moon, though if you're playing blue-red, it's less of an issue. But you're still going to have a number of cases in which some number of your spells and some numbers of your lands don't cast those spells. There are going to be more draws that you have to mulligan because either you drew like 3 Doomblades and no black source, or you drew all shock lands against burn. Like there is some cost you are going to pay. Not every game, but some games you're going to be at a slight disadvantage by not being monocolor. You're also going to, and you open yourself up to Blood Moon as an additional just potential way to hose you out. There's also the fact that you're looking at raising the price of the deck significantly in terms of actual dollars and cents. If you already have them, it's not an issue. But right now, the fetch lands, the blue fetch lands from Zendikar, are $100 each. If you're adding 6 of them to your deck, you're adding $600 to the cost of your deck. If I didn't have them, the minimal power gain would not be enough for me to decide to drop an extra $600 on the deck. And that's the other thing about it. Your overall increase in power is not particularly high. If you want main deck removal that's hard removal, you can run Dismember, and it works about as well. It works better than Lightning Bolt in most cases. It works about as well as Doomblade, and there's very few things that path is going to be just hardly or stone cold better than. So it's not that it's bad, but it's you are not getting a lot for what you are trading. I would say it's overall increase in power level of the deck of maybe like 4 or 5% ish. Like 4 of your cards become slightly better, but your mana becomes significantly worse. Your mutavaults become a lot worse because often you're going to be like, man, I really wish this was just an island. Swords are another thing I've seen a lot of people run. I used to run Sword of Fire and Ice, and I tried out Sword of War and Peace for a while in the deck. They're very powerful, but most of the time I drew a sword. There was kind of this, if this was just another Merfolk, I'd probably be in just a much better position because they eat up a lot of your turn. Like 3 mana and then 2 to equip is a lot of mana, especially if your opponent is potentially playing Lightning Bolt and you're risking having spent basically 2 turns in a row to just get bolted and then get nothing for having spent those entire 2 turns. That said, once a creature hits with a sword, it's really hard to come back from especially Sword of Fire and Ice, where your 2/2 getting in for 6 damage or 4 and killing a creature and drawing you a card is a huge swing. I don't like them, but they are justifiable, if not great. I wouldn't run more than one though. This is my current list. 15 islands, 1 Minimo because I don't have an Obro, 4 Mutavaults, 4 Curse Catchers, 2 Kira, 4 Lords, 4 Masters, 2 Masters of Waves, 4 Regeries, 2 Phantasmal Images, 4 Silvergill Adepts, 4 Vials, 1 Deprive, which is, I think I swapped out a Void Snag for it, which is actually should be a Vapor Snag. Spelled that wrong. Well, used the wrong word. 2 Spell Pierce, 4 Spreading Seas, and then my sideboard right now is 2 Dismember for more creature-oriented matches, especially Twin, and to a lesser extent Pod. 2 Grafdigger's Cage, which is laser focus pointed at Pod. Don't make the mistake of siding in against Living End. 3 Hibernation, which is also actually against Pod. 2 Pithing Needles, which are just good sideboard cards against a lot of decks. But most of the time they basically have Karn written on them. 2 Spell Pierce for matchups where I need to be interacting more with their spells like Storm, and 4 Tidebender Mages for decks that play green creatures that cost 1 and a green.